Hello, this is a recording primarily for the Suffolk Jungian Circle on the theme of the Puer Aeternus, or the Puer Aeternus, the subject matter of the October discussion. But of course, as with these recordings we've made previously, it might be of interest to other people who are not members of that circle, who want to reflect on these issues and might find them useful. And if you would like to participate in the discussion, let me know, and I will send you the Teams link to join in. So the Puer Aeternus, which is the masculine version, the Puer Aeternus, the feminine version of the same concept, the same idea, is the eternal boy or the eternal girl, just to be gender inclusive or whatever you'd call it. Well, I'll try and stick with eternal child, although the terminology is itself gendered, but most of what I say will apply equally to the male and female versions, although there are arguably some distinctions between the two. So Jung starts talking about this initially as a psychological complex, a sort of a hang-up, if you like, that some people experience, but then he later goes on to talk about it as an archetype. And the two ideas don't wholly contradict each other, in that elsewhere in his works he talks about this idea which he sometimes refers to as inflation, nothing to do with economic theories, whereby an archetype can take over the individuality of a person, and they become so identified with an archetype that they sort of lose their humanity in a sense. They become a walking stereotype rather than a subtle, nuanced, complex human being. And so when early on he's talking about this sort of eternal child as a neurotic complex, that can be understood as someone who has become overwhelmed by the otherwise positive archetype within themselves. And all archetypes have a sort of a light and a dark, a good bit and a bad bit to them. The eternal child no different from anything else in this capacity. So if we think about the overview of the eternal child, on the positive side, these are qualities of innocence, trust, hopefulness, faith in the future, innocent joy, pleasure in life, pleasure in just playing games, having fun, laughing, rejoicing, running through the daisies with the wind in your hair, and having a lovely time of it the way small children will do without a care in the world. It also extends into adolescence, and primarily when he's talking about it in the terms of a neurosis, he's more referring to an adolescent state of mind than to a small child state of mind. But potentially you could have someone who has either. So that's the positive side. So those qualities within each human being, no matter how old you get, where you still retain, or at least you do if you haven't kind of repressed it, at least, you still retain that childlike capacity for wonder and joy and pleasure and laughter and just living in the moment, having that kind of almost puppy-like mentality of being here and now and present, which has enjoyed a bit of a resurgence, that sort of idea of being in the moment as a philosophical concept, partly inspired by Buddhism and used as a therapeutic technique to get people to stop brooding about yesterday, stop getting anxious about tomorrow, but live in the moment, in the present, in the here and now, which is more the sort of childlike mentality, the eternal child. The negative side of this is someone who never grows up, who is so over-identified or inflated with this childlike pattern of behaviour, or moody adolescent pattern of behaviour, that they don't progress beyond it, they don't mature into their adult self, and they're constantly retreating back to these childlike patterns. Now there's various ways in which this can manifest. A lot of what Jung and Marie-Louise von France talk about is the idea of, and usually they talk about men, but there's no reason why it couldn't happen to a woman as well, adults who are commitment shy. They don't want to commit to a relationship or to a job or to signing a housing lease or a mortgage or anything that might necessitate them being focused and committed for a long term. They're so in the moment that they are incapable of planning for tomorrow, or I say incapable, unwilling to plan for tomorrow. They could overcome this, so they can learn to be capable. It's not that it's beyond the bounds of possibility, it's just that they don't want to. And they retreat into this rather childlike dependence, and dependence is a key feature here. Just as the child ultimately depends on mum and dad, so the chronically immature depend on more sensible people around them, which could well be mum and dad. This is a growing phenomenon. And a lot of people have seen Marie-Louise Villefrance's writings as almost prophetic of the way the world would go in the years after her death, where more and more adults in their 20s, 30s, etc., instead of leaving home, getting a good job, getting a place of their own, starting their own family, travelling the world, doing kind of grown-up type things, continue living in mum and dad's, stereotypically in the basement, retreating into this very dependent state where mum, even though she could be in her 50s or 60s by this point in time, is still doing their washing and darning their socks and making their dinner and deliberately or otherwise infantilizing them. The individual's retreated to a very kind of infantile or at least adolescent state, and they're not growing up. There's various economic reasons why people often do struggle to leave home and get enough money to put a deposit on somewhere, so it's not automatically down to emotional retardation, but that clearly is a significant factor for some people, that their inability to launch into the world as adults may be partially economic, but is also partially that they just don't want to in the first place. They much prefer to be looked after and pampered rather than to stand on their own 2 feet and learn to do things for themselves. So it becomes neurosis when it's in that sort of state. Relationship-wise, you've got somebody who perhaps has endless one-night stands or very, very short-lived relationships, and as soon as there's a whiff of commitment required, they disappear off onto the next and the next and the next and the next. Or maybe they convince themselves that they are incapable of having a relationship, so they stop even trying to have a relationship in the first place, and they live like sort of early teenage boys, or early teenage girls for that matter, gazing wistfully at the sex of their choice, and wishing they could have a relationship but never quite plucking up the courage to go and try and initiate one, and sometimes get quite bitter and angry and resentful because of that. So there is a refusal to progress. Now the potential here, of course, is for some people almost the opposite kind of problem can happen, that they may become so identified with the archetype which sits directly opposite the eternal child, which is the senex, the wise old man or the wise old woman, that they become over mature and they lose the ability for fun and laughter and rejoicing and living in the moment. They become very sort of dried out and responsible to the point of being almost sort of miserable and puritanical and joyless and brittle. They go to the opposite extreme. That is a phenomenon not entirely unrelated to eldest child syndrome, if we're thinking in terms of Alfred Adler's writings about the personalities of eldest, youngest and middle children, in that if a child has had a lot of burdens put on them, like maybe caring for an unwell parent or trying to economically support the family home if perhaps mum and dad has died quite suddenly and there's little money and the kid has had to kind of go out for work and start doing things at a much younger age than they normally would have done, then they can slot into that overly grown up frame of mind and they lose contact with the childlike part of themselves, which doesn't get the opportunity to live to its fullest. So it's a bit of a kind of a delicate tightrope act, a bit of a Goldilocks scenario where it's not too much, it's not too little, it's just right. It's getting that golden mean of balance with the eternal child, which is perhaps easier said than done at times. But those are the potential pitfalls of somebody not quite getting the balance right. Too little, too much. We could debate, maybe this is a topic to pick up on in the group discussion, whether the emotionally arrested male is noticeably different from the emotionally arrested female, or do they both manifest in similar sorts of ways? So I mentioned that a lot of the writings from Marie-Louise von France and from Jung himself tend to focus on men more so than on women who've got this arrested development, but so a bit of perhaps an underdeveloped area to explore with women who have retreated into a more infantile state. But there are more extreme examples than a 30-year-old still living in their childhood bedroom and retreating from reality. A key feature which von France picks up on a bit but becomes more pronounced in the years since her death is the games industry, which lots of people, there's nothing particularly wrong in liking computer games or board games or whatever type of games, but I suspect for the kind of therapeutic approach, the question again is a bit of a Goldilocks one, getting it right and not spending way too much time dwelling in realms of fantasy and game playing, which increasingly is perhaps more likely to happen. And again, maybe this is more a male thing than a female thing. I'm not into computer games, so I don't quite know what the statistics and the patterns are on this one. But that sort of stereotyped image of the person living in the parents' basement or in their childhood bedroom, spending all day, every day, immersed in computer games and hardly ever engaging in the adult mature world. They're kind of retreating to this sort of teenage state of just wanting to play all of the time, except it's no longer Cluedo and Monopoly or whatever board games kids play these days. I've no idea. It's increasingly computer-based gaming, but the kind of mentality is arguably the same, whatever the technological manifestation the games take. At a more pronounced and sexualized, often, well, maybe not every single time, but frequently sexualized angle is the practice of infantilism, of people who like to wear nappies or in some other capacity dress up as a baby or as a child. I don't know if possibly that's more a factor of age, given that kids these days are maybe less likely to dress in child-specific clothing, whereas a few generations ago there often was that kind of schoolboy, schoolgirl style of clothing and then more adult styles of clothing. But it's that regression to wanting to be childlike, which if somebody wants to do that once in a blue moon, who cares? But from a therapeutic angle, if it comes to dominate the individual, so they spend so much time either dressing as a child or wishing they could dress as a child, that they are less and less and less engaged with adult life. And it's not simply a matter of putting on clothing that maybe you're a few decades too old to be wearing. It's because we're not, well, this is a question, is this when it manifests in women more in the line of mutton dressed as lamb rather than the full-on childlike outfit, whereas maybe in men it's more the full-on childlike outfit rather than just going for teenage fashions. Although you do get that kind of midlife crisis of men who suddenly start dressing like they're 18 when in fact they're 45 or 50 or whatever they may be. But it's a retreat, and not just into clothing, it's a wish to retreat from adult responsibilities and the demands of the adult world, mature relationships, maybe being a parent yourself, having to take responsibility for kids, having to pay bills, having to put up with a stroppy boss, do this, do that, do the other, and a wish to go back to a period in life, a Freudian regression approach, which he talks about, and Jung still goes with this idea despite the split with Freud, that regression as a defence mechanism is a prevalent one. If the stresses of adult life get too much, the appeal becomes to go back to an era in life, whether that's when you were 15 or 10 or 5 or whatever, when you did not have those stresses and you felt safer and secure. And for some people that regression is a sort of a somewhat strange sexual infantilist practice. For others it's maybe more that they just go and get their favourite teddy bear out of the cupboard and sit and watch whatever nostalgia TV programmes that remind them of their childhood, and they have maybe not a full-on regression in terms of strange sexual practices, but they have a kind of an emotional retreat to a happier period of their life, a more relaxed, less stressful, more optimistic period of their life. There's lots of stress management techniques. In and of itself, it's not a wholly destructive thing, unless, going back to Goldilocks, it becomes excessive, becomes too much, and less time is spent in the present and more time is spent retreating to an earlier phase of life. That's when it becomes somewhat more problematic. It can be overcome. That's the positive news. Engaging in adult life and finding positives in adult life. So being an adult doesn't have to be wall-to-wall stress. There's happy, pleasant positives to be had. Maybe that person is just kind of entered into a bit of a grotty period of their life where the stress has piled up and they've forgotten and lost track of the positives, and that maybe they need a bit of a prompt, a bit of a reminder that there are positives to be had. It's not all doom and gloom, and they don't have to retreat into this fantasy childhood life. So there's an element of that. Excuse me. Jung cites a quotation from the Bible where Jesus is saying to people, "Become ye as little children." And there's various theological interpretations of that, but Jung is suggesting there is a reference here to the adults, that Jesus is actually talking to adults, not to kiddies, and he is saying, find your inner innocence, find that sort of openness, that freshness, that faith. Faith not just in the sort of the usual sense that religious people mean the term faith in God, but a trust in life, that people who've been through a lot of hardship often have their optimism, their faith that life is good and joyful and nice things will happen, have it knocked out of them. Excuse me. Until they come to just expect life to be one long drudge, one long lurch from chaos to disaster and back again. They stop taking pleasure in life. And so this become ye as little children, at least in Jung's interpretation, is partly about the mature mind being mature enough that it can open up to an innocent faith, a childlike, not childish, but childlike faith in the goodness of God, as Jesus would have it, or in the goodness of whatever it is that that person believes in. That life has much to offer, and look forward to what life has to offer rather than see it all as doom and gloom and a chaotic slide towards an empty grave. So there is, in that sense, a sort of a move forward. There's also, I think, as Chesterton, I think, was it Chesterton or was it Lewis? I can't remember now. I think it was Chesterton. Talks about being that kids, you kind of reach a point in their towards the end of their childhood where they become a bit embarrassed by things like fairy tales and the stuff they loved when they were very little. They go into a bit of a hormonal huff and they think, oh, I don't want anything to do with that, I'm all grown up now, I've got no interest in childish things, and chuck them away. But then as adults, if you mature and become emotionally stable as an adult, then you can reach the point where you can revisit the fairy tales, the myths, the legends, the sources of innocent joy that you had as a child, and find joy in them again, but from a more of an adult angle this time. That you are no longer embarrassed by the things that embarrassed you as a hormonal teenager. You are able to find that child self within you again without being cringy or embarrassed about it. And that's a sign of maturity, not that you remain adolescent forever, but that you go through that awkward teenage phase into adult maturity and then rediscover your inner child in a constructive fashion, in a positive fashion. Rediscover the joys and the optimisms and the innocence and the love of fantasy and fairy tale and myth and legend and so on, and it opens up a whole new sort of world for you. Freud, having mentioned him earlier, talks about the idea of the Apprentice Complex, which is a resolution to the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex in women, that the child, having become hostile to the parent of the same sex and jealous and resentful of them interfering in their relationship with the parent of the opposite sex, develops a fear, is a kind of a projected fear according to Freud, that the child resents that parent and assumes that the parent resents them. And there are certainly families in which they do. It's not an assumption, they do resent the kid. And that leads to a fear of repercussions, a fear of being hurt by the parent in some capacity. And how does that resolve? Well, Freud says it's this apprentice phase that the child goes through, where they start identifying with the parent of the same sex. They learn the tricks of adulthood that the parent of the same sex has learned, and they move for a boy towards manhood or for a girl towards womanhood, and start imitating. So you see little boys trying to shave in front of the mirror the way they see their dad doing, things like that. Start to kind of apprentice themselves to the parent of the same sex and learn to be more like them. And part of the problem with the neurotic version of the eternal child is that the child, and again, just to reiterate for the umpteenth time, a lot of the early writings were more focused on boys and young men going through this rather than girls and young women. So possibly it's a bit different for girls and young women, but I'll leave that one open. That boys, at least, when they should be maturing into young men, may emotionally retreat back to the mother archetype, the great mother, and instead of identifying with dad and apprenticing to dad, they are remaining tied to the apron strings of the mother archetype. And Jung talks about this kind of playing out in real world relationships rather than the purely internalized world of the psyche, where if the husband and father is dead or has run off or is so immersed in work or whatever other demands there are upon them, that they are less and less and less engaged in the life of their spouse and the life of their children, then the mother and her son, and potentially this could equally apply to her daughter and so forth, form a kind of somewhat unhealthy pair bond, in which because the mother's not getting much emotional sustenance from the father, because either he's not there or he's otherwise engaged with work or something, that she turns to her child for an emotional sustenance, and because the child is equally not engaged with the father for much the same reasons, they turn to the mother to provide what is not coming from the same-sex parent. And it leads to a kind of unhealthy collusion. And so you don't necessarily go full hog into Norman Bates' Psycho Hotel of dressing up as mother when they're older, but it develops into a very unhealthy adult relationship of excess dependence, in which the biologically mature but mentally immature young man still has this very childlike attachment to their mother and has not learnt to move into adult male spheres, because they haven't apprenticed to their father in the same way that some other boy might have done. And equally, we might make comparable arguments about young women if they're going through these kind of emotional arrested phases. What is it that's going on there? Why are they not maturing? So there is a tendency to over-identify with one parent and under-identify with the other. part of that is not cutting the apron strings, constantly retreating back to home, retreating back to mother. And it is in that slightly creepy mother, Norman Bates sort of a way, that the domineering maternal figure, who's not acting out of wickedness, they're acting out of loneliness and isolation and needing some kind of support from somebody, but they're not getting it from their husband or other men that they potentially might turn to. They are trying to find it within the domestic sphere with the kids. And that's not healthy for either in the long run. So that's in terms of why it happens, why people fail to mature, at least according to Jung, it may be because that relationship has never developed in a healthy fashion, it's not progressed. Doesn't mean it can't, just because it's delayed doesn't mean with therapeutic help and self-reflection and conscious decision on the part of both the mother and child that they couldn't move that relationship on to a much more healthy, mature level. So there's always the optimism of kind of therapeutic resolution to what's going on there. But that becomes part of an explanation for why, for boys at least, they may be stuck in this kind of ongoing adolescence even when they're 25, 35, 45. They're still stuck in this adolescent mentality of being bound to their mother's apron strings and doing what she wants and never quite striking out on their own, doing their own thing, which would be considered by Jung, by Louise von France and a bunch of others, as the much more healthy, mature, sensible thing to do, to move out, become an independent force. An element of what they pick up on, and James Hollis makes a similar kind of suggestion, is that the role of the mother is chiefly, both human mothers and the sort of maternal archetype at a collective unconscious level, is to nurture and support and protect and encircle with a sort of, cuddling the child and shielding them from threats and risks, whereas the function of the father, certainly with sons, we can debate whether with daughters as well, but certainly with sons, is more to push the child outwards towards independence, to get the kid to go and climb trees, and if they fall out and scuff their knees, to pick them up and say, stop crying, get on with it, and push them towards maturity. And that maturity is ultimately leaving the home rather than staying in it forever, whereas the maternal urge is to keep them in the home. So you've got two kind of opposing elements, and it is worth bearing in mind that when Jung is talking about archetypes, he is suggesting they're not directly linked to biology, so that you could have a father who is more maternal, you could have a woman, a mother who is more paternal, in terms of how they articulate those energies. So it is not as straightforward as women always do this and men always do that. It is a bit more nuanced. But the paternal or patriarchal or whatever you want to call it energies are pushing outwards, and the maternal ones drawing inwards. And ultimately what the child needs is both. There may be phases in life that become cyclical, growing up. So at certain points they may be more in need of maternal qualities, and at other points they may be more in need of paternal qualities, or a 50-50 of both. But if they are significantly lacking one or the other, then the child's development is likely to be hampered, slowed down. As per Erik Erikson's argument about the various stages that the child and then adult go through, getting hampered at one stage rather hamstrings you to develop fully and wholly at the subsequent stages, but it is still not impossible to revisit a stage, identify what went wrong and correct it, and then move forward in a much healthier, more positive fashion. So rather than seeing it all as a kind of tale of doom and gloom and inevitable damage, it becomes a more upbeat idea that most damage can be reversed and addressed and made better. So there's a sort of a focus on the upbeat on that one. Hollis also talks a bit about the way some cultures have transition rituals from child to adulthood. So a bit like a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah in Judaism, and comparable rituals in other cultures and religions around the world. So the Romans, or at least the rich ones at any rate, the patricians, would have a ceremony where the boy becomes a man, and part of that ceremony is taking things that are symbolic of childhood, articles of clothing, a protective talisman that was worn around the neck, so on, and ritualistically disposing of them, chucking them on a bonfire, for example, and relinquishing childhood as part of the ceremony, whereby once the ritual is over, you are officially a man or officially a woman, in both a legalistic sense as well as in a biological sense. Some cultures it's at a fixed age, in other cultures they are waiting for the body to tick over and puberty to happen, which obviously varies from kid to kid as to quite when things happen. And so when the biological signs kick in, that's when they do the ritual. So there's variable shifts. But one of the points that Hollis is making, and others, quite a few others, sociologists, psychologists, etc., have made, is that in those cultures that do have a coming of age ceremony, there is a more clearly defined barrier, demarcation, whatever you want to call it, between the child and the adult. People know where they are. What we have problematically in Britain is a succession of laws which stagger childhood and the transition into adulthood. So you can drive a moped at one age, but you've got to wait for a few years before you can get a car licence. You can vote at this age, but you can't necessarily get married at that age. You've got to wait till... So rather than there be one age, wallop, done, you're an adult, get on with it, there is this sort of shilly-shallying around. And increasingly a number of sociologists and psychologists are arguing this is very unhealthy, that we would be much better off to follow the example of a number of ancient cultures have a cut-off point. You reach an age legally in terms of paperwork, and ideally having some sort of ceremony, a ritual to mark it, an event that takes place where you go, boom, you're no longer a boy, you're no longer a girl, you're now a man, you're now a woman. Boom, done. And that's more likely to assist, the argument goes, in the kind of psychological shift out of the eternal child state and into the adult state in a healthy way, by relinquishing the past and moving into the future and seeing the future. And argue this is part of a lot of ancient ceremonies. It's the future is seen as a good thing. Yes, whilst there are elements of sadness about leaving your childhood behind. Oh, I won't be able to do that anymore. I won't be able to do that anymore. It should be more. Oh, I can now do this. I can now do that, and it's a gain rather than a loss, or at least society should present it as a gain rather than a loss. So it's focusing on the positives, and clearly saying to somebody, "Oh, you can now pay your own taxes," is not necessarily going to be interpreted as a positive. So you maybe need to reflect that becoming an adult is a lot about duties and responsibilities, which can be irksome, let's face it, but it's also about positive gains and advantages, and so that needs to be presented to the adolescent that they are moving towards a positive rather than it just being what they cannot do anymore, just being about loss. So that becomes, again, perhaps a way of assisting people in achieving psychological maturity, psychological shifting. That said, there are famous examples of people, well, a fictional one is the one that comes to my mind, where having the ritual doesn't necessarily make an awful lot of difference. So there's a novel, I'm pretty sure it's been made into a film at some point, Portnoy's Complaint, in which Portnoy, who's a Jewish character, is a mature man, but he's got this horrendously domineering mother, a kind of a stereotypical caricature of a Jewish mother, who's very controlling and very overbearing and has absolutely no sense of his need for privacy or his need for kind of discretion. So she'll blurt things out in public and ask him about his bowel movements and things. There's no sense of his having grown up. So despite the fact that he would have, being Jewish, have gone through a bar mitzvah, it's in his fictionalised case not necessarily achieved any change. He's still very much under the maternal thumb, tied to the apron strings. Even when she's dead, he's still tied to the apron strings, and her ghost comes back to haunt him and can constantly go on and on and on and on and on at him. So the ritual isn't an absolute solution to all problems, but I'd suggest it's a significant move towards resolving a lot of issues and making that transition more positive, more attractive. So maybe as a culture we need to rethink how we do these things. Maybe those religions that have somewhat lost track of what they did in the ancient past in terms of coming of age ceremonies and need to reconsider reviving coming of age ceremonies in some format or another, so that it will help the kind of mental process of maturation, which is ultimately the key figure here, or key concern here, is to achieve that balance between mental maturation and the capacity to have joy and innocence even when you are 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. To not lose track of the positives of the eternal child whilst also embracing the positives of the adult, of the move forward. I think that's probably more than enough wittering on. I could just briefly finish by mentioning there's a book by Dan Killy, talking about the Peter Pan complex, which has become a kind of a popular jargon term to describe, again, chiefly men more so than women, who are old enough to know better but don't, want to live this permanent teenage life rather than grow up and mature. It's not, Peter Pan complex is not an acknowledged medical terminology, but it is used extensively in chat shows and women's magazines and things as a terminology to describe what Jung is referring to as this neurotic state of the eternal child who's not quite grown up yet, despite physically, biologically being an adult, but up here is still 13, 14, 15 years old in their emotional responses and their expectations of life and how other people should do everything for them, and they've not quite kind of got with it. But yes, that's just a bit of a side point. So I'll leave it there, and we can discuss these ideas in the group at the end of the month. And if any of the people listening are not in the group would like to discuss the ideas, or put a post or a response saying whether you agreed, whether you disagree, whether you got extra information to add, whether you have personal experiences you want to share in your own life or the life of somebody you know, that reflect on this issue of the eternal child, that would be lovely. Thank you.